Hello students, this is part 3, our final part in the discussion of the Stuart Cycle of poems from Gary Jackson and his book Missing You, Metropolis. The final poem, the last poem to deal with Stuart, is the poem Fade. Fade brings together a lot of the other themes and concepts presented in the Stuart poems and ties them all together. At its core, as you read the poem, ask yourself these questions. How does the poem represent a final statement on responsibility and friendship? How does Jackson, the author, argue for letting go as an important aspect of mental health? And finally, how does the poem suggest that saying goodbye is the most important way to remember somebody who has died? Let's take a look at the poem. Before we analyze the poem line by line, please take this time to read the poem Fade. Then come back and restart the video. Welcome back. So, the beginning of the poem Fade, we have the Jackson narrator talking to us about what he felt after Stuart had committed suicide. So if we are thinking chronologically between poems, this poem comes after the poem Emergency. So let's look at these selections of important lines. Stuart talked to me in dreams so real, I believed in God for those 3 years. Now, these two lines that start off the poem, it's important to remember that when the narrator is talking about believing in God for those 3 years, this is not a positive statement. This is a negative statement. This is a statement that he is being tormented by these dreams because they are so vivid. Normally, we don't believe in spirits as a society. But these dreams that he is having of Stuart are so intense that he's feeling they are almost visions from God, and visions from God are painful. Next, lines 5 through 6. I came out as if I were 10 again, when the world is so fresh, even the neighborhood is foreign. So, the bulk of this poem is the narrator describing to you some of the dreams he had about Stuart, and then ending with the last dream he had about Stuart. So, the narrator is dreaming initially about a time of nostalgia, when Stuart and he were 10 and the world was fresh. This is a time, a happy time, right? As we talked about in the last video, feelings of nostalgia are memories for things that are happy. Good feelings you have about memories of things that have happened in your past. In lines 9 and 10, he describes how in this dream, Stuart said he was sorry for walking to California without telling anyone. So, if we look at these last lines, this nostalgic feeling that begins the dream, all right, is making him feel happy because it's allowing him to ignore the fact that Stuart has died. He is remembering Stuart and his times as young friends, but understands that Stuart is dead. Right? But his dreams are presenting him like Stuart isn't dead. Right? Stuart told him he simply walked to California, right? Which could mean, in the logic of the dream itself, that Stuart is alive. So this is what makes this beginning feeling so nostalgic and happy. But as the dream continues, we see something happen. So, as the Jackson narrator is describing Stuart looking fine, feeling this nostalgic part of the first part of the dream, the narrator looks back and sees this. When I look back, he sees his leathered face and porcelain eyes. In lines 18 to 19, he says, he was resurrected and fine, except for an olive-sized hole in his head. So, the logic of the dreams, which make these dreams so painful for the narrator, is that they start off in a wonderful feeling of nostalgia, a memory of his friend Stuart. But at some point in all of the dreams, when the narrator looks to Stuart, he is encountered with the reality that Stuart is dead. He sees a leathered face and porcelain eyes sometimes. If you're having trouble kind of grasping the image presented here, look up anything about zombies or The Walking Dead. That would be a leathered face with porcelain eyes. Or sometimes when he looks back, he sees Stuart looking fine except for the hole left by the gun when Stuart committed suicide. So you can kind of think of the logic of the dreams being presented. Everything seems fine. It's presented like Stuart is alive and well. The narrator turns away, looks back, and he is confronted by the reality that Stuart is dead. He is presented by a nightmare image that shatters his nostalgic memory for his friend and impresses on him that his friend is dead. Now imagine having this dream repeatedly, like the narrator tells you. This change from thinking things are fine to the reality that things are dead is what causes these dreams to be nightmares for our narrator, which causes these dreams to be painful for the Jackson narrator. So let's look at the last lines of the poem and see how the Jackson narrator was finally able to be at peace. He was finally able to escape these painful nightmares of Stuart's death. In the last dream, he turned into the usual corpse, and I waited for my alarm clock. Suddenly he became whole again, jumped up, his brown skin renewed. Just kidding, he said, as if he were dead, as if he were never dead. And before I could do anything more than smile, he waved goodbye, walked off like John Wayne, into the desert sun, right before everything fades to black. So this is the last dream. This is the dream that represents a moment when the narrator began to heal from the trauma of Stuart's death. Right? This last dream turns the poem Fade from a description of painful nightmares into one of a healthy form of closure. Notice how in this last dream, Stuart's transformation is reversed. All right? Instead of being confronted with the dead body, when he looks back, suddenly Stuart is whole again, his brown skin renewed, looking like the memory. And this healing, though, is only possible because of the ending of the poem. The fact that Stuart leaves. He is leaving. Right? If we look, the phrase fades to black represents when a movie ends. As you watch a movie or even a TV show, what will happen is you will have the last scene of that movie, then the screen will fade to black briefly. There'll be a 2-second pause, and then the credits will roll. And that fading to black signals to you, the viewer, that this has ended. So the last lines of the poem, Stuart leaving, all right, Stuart is leaving the scene like the end of a movie. And this fading to black represents a healthy aspect of letting go. The reason why the narrator in this poem was tormented for the dreams is because he was holding together the nostalgic moments. All right, he was holding on to Stuart's memory so intensely that he could not escape the pain of his death. The nostalgic moments that begin the poems are inextricably tied to the nightmare moments of Stuart's death. It's only by letting go completely, by having that realization that Stuart is dead and he needs to let this memory go, right, that he will have a moment of peace. It represents a healthy act, right, both for him and the memory of Stuart. If we look at how Stuart is described in this moment of fading to black, he is walking off like John Wayne. For those of you who are unfamiliar, John Wayne is a famous American actor who played a cowboy and was known for having a very sauntering sort of walk. All right? If you think of the way a cowboy struts, that a lot of that is from the way that John Wayne walked. So as Stuart is walking off into the desert sun, right, he's kind of having this healthy, cocky, confident strut like a cowboy. So Stuart is not going off to the end, right? These memories of Stuart are going off as a good thing. Stuart is smiling, walking like a cocky cowboy into the desert sun. This last scene, this fading to black is a healthy moment of in terms of how the narrator is coping with the trauma of Stuart's death. Overall, Fade wants to stress the idea that forgetting or letting go is the only way to move past grief. What heals the narrator is their ability to forget parts of Stuart, to let him fade from the front of their mind. Essentially, to move past grief, one must be able to allow themselves to forget certain parts of the person that they have lost. So this runs counter to ideas of holding on so intensely to the memory of a person who has died. You have to realize that you are going to have to forget some aspects of their life in order to move on. Holding somebody so close, like the narrator does at the beginning of the poem, is a damaging and painful way to deal with the trauma of a loved one's death. So, as together, all right, as a journey, the poems about Stuart represents Jackson's poetic statements on how to grieve. The Jackson narrator learns that forgetting, letting go, is a key part in healing trauma. Stuart, as a ghost in Fade, is a metaphor for how the reader needs to learn to forget parts of your loved ones, to let memories go in order to move on with healing and grief. This concludes our discussion of the Stuart cycle of poems.